Module 14, the respiratory system. Respiratory control. When we talk about control of breathing, you probably already know that you don't need to think about breathing continuously. Your body will inhale and exhale without you thinking about it all day and night. But you do have some control over this process. If you want to, you can hold your breath, stopping the breathing process for a bit. You can also intentionally take deeper or shallower breaths for a while too. But when you exercise, you don't need to intentionally make your respiratory system work faster. It just knows to do it. What's going on with the control of ventilation? Well, this control occurs primarily in the medullary respiratory center of the medulla oblongata. You see, in the medulla, there are two groups of neurons, the dorsal respiratory groups and the ventral respiratory groups. Additionally, there's another neuron group in the pons, appropriately called the pontine respiratory group. The pontine group is responsible for helping the switch between inspiration and expiration. It takes about 2 seconds for an average inhale and about 3 seconds for an average exhale at rest. So your body breathes in and out to a specific rhythm. This rhythm is controlled by some of the neurons in the ventral groups called the Prebotzinger complex. Now, the dorsal respiratory groups are responsible for control of the diaphragm. When they send action potentials, the diaphragm contracts, and when they stop, the diaphragm relaxes. That allows you to inhale and exhale, respectively. The ventral respiratory groups work to stimulate the abdominal and intercostal muscles when you need to breathe more intensively, like when you're exercising. They cause more motor units within those muscles to contract. Thus, you take in more oxygen for greater ventilation, and the cells receive more of that oxygen that they are needing. Now, there's an interesting reflex system involved with ventilation. When you're exercising, you breathe more intensively, causing your lungs to expand more than they do when you're breathing at rest. But you don't want them to overexpand, or the delicate tissues will rupture. So the Herring-Breuer reflex keeps that from happening. You see, when you take a deep breath, your bronchioles have receptors on them that become stretched. They then send action potentials to the medulla oblongata. Notice how much of that part of the brain is involved in breathing. I keep mentioning it. Well, anyway, if there are more and more action potentials from these receptors, the medulla will inhibit the dorsal respiratory group, which will stop inspiration and allow for expiration. That way, you cannot take in too large of a breath. This is yet another negative feedback system in the body. The bronchial receptors identify you're inhaling too deeply, and they send action potentials to stop inhalation. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section, the medulla oblongata and the pons are responsible for controlling the rhythmic breathing automatically. But there's a chemical control system set in place as well. It greatly affects how deep an inhale can be, as well as how quickly you can breathe. And not surprisingly, it involves one of the gases involved in respiration, carbon dioxide. So we can say that carbon dioxide levels, via their effect on pH, are the major controllers of ventilation. During respiration, approximately 1 molecule of oxygen is taken in for every 1 molecule of carbon dioxide that's removed from the blood. So the chemical control system in the body keeps tabs on the carbon dioxide levels in the blood to make sure that respiration is occurring at a proper rate. Why did I mention pH when I stated carbon dioxide's role in chemical control? Well, remember that carbon dioxide easily dissolves into the blood plasma, which is mostly water. When it does, it forms carbonic acid in this chemical equation. Carbon dioxide plus water gives you H2CO3. H2CO3 is carbonic acid. Remember that the definition of an acid is a chemical that releases hydrogen ions. Carbonic acid then breaks down to release a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. This process, called acid dissociation, causes a lower pH in the solution. If you remember, the pH of a solution is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration. So more hydrogen ions, the higher the acidity of a solution. Thus, we can say that the more carbon dioxide in the blood plasma, the lower the pH of the blood. That's because more carbon dioxide means more dissociated carbonic acid, resulting in more hydrogen ions in the blood. In other words, the more carbon dioxide, the lower the pH. The body removes carbon dioxide by ventilation, particularly by exhalation. So the more ventilation, the more carbon dioxide is removed. If you've been working out for a long time, you will be breathing at a greater rate. That's because you've lots of carbon dioxide in your blood, which has made your blood pH too low or more acidic. So the more ventilation, the more carbon dioxide is exhaled, and your blood pH will rise back to normal. Now, this works the other way too. If your blood pH is too alkaline, then your body will want to retain carbon dioxide to lower that pH, so it will reduce the speed and depth of your breathing. We can say the respiratory system helps the body maintain its pH then through controlled ventilation. Increased ventilation will increase blood pH by removing excess carbon dioxide. Decreased ventilation will decrease blood pH by retaining carbon dioxide. And thus we can conclude that the pH of blood is the primary controller of ventilation rate. The control of all this starts in the medulla oblongata. There's a group of chemoreceptors located on its surface, appropriately called central chemoreceptors of the medulla oblongata. We can refer to them as medullary chemoreceptors. These are not the same as the respiratory groups of neurons I talked about earlier, which controlled ventilation rhythm. The medullary chemoreceptors affect how fast and how deeply you breathe. This is a good example of how all the systems of your body beautifully work together. You see, with extra carbon dioxide in the body, the blood pH is lowered. Remember how the blood supplies the cerebrospinal fluid that covers and surrounds the brain's surface? Well, if the blood pH is lower, then the cerebrospinal fluid will also have a lower pH. That affects the central chemoreceptors of the medulla, which will stimulate the lungs to increase the rate and depth of ventilation, so more carbon dioxide will be expelled, and the pH of the blood, and thus the cerebrospinal fluid, will go up. So those chemoreceptors of the medulla are receiving signals, not from blood, but from cerebrospinal fluid, which comes from the blood. It's kind of an indirect way to monitor blood pH. Conversely, if the pH is too high, the central chemoreceptors of the medulla will send signals so the rate and depth of ventilation is decreased, so carbon dioxide will be kept in the blood, lowering the pH. Now, there are sensors in the respiratory system that identify oxygen. The carotid and aortic body chemoreceptors are in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. There they can identify the blood traveling through those vessels. That blood is oxygenated. Thankfully, they're not super sensitive. The partial pressure of oxygen has to drop from 95 millimeters of mercury to below 80 millimeters of mercury before the chemoreceptors will send action potentials to the medullary respiratory center so that ventilation can be increased. They don't really need to be super sensitive because the response to changes in blood pH is so acute. Well, you need to know that all of those stimuli I just discussed in correcting carbon dioxide concentrations will automatically correct oxygen levels too.